All right, welcome class to our week 3 lecture presentation. This week we're going to be talking about setting and how that works in fiction. So let's go ahead and get started. So setting basically is the physical place and time where and when an event occurs in a work of fiction or in a work of literature. So this is often where we see a lot of sensory details included. So, sensory details, those are the things that we experience with our five senses. And, if you want to read a really good book or a really good story, oftentimes an author or what we say when we read something that's really good is that we feel like we're there, right? We feel like we're in the story. And the way that authors do that is by using sensory details and descriptive writing that helps us imagine the place and time that the story is set in. Now, of course, fiction also includes things like plot and characters, which we've already talked about. And these are all elements within literature. And so setting really actually plays a large part in creating the work as a whole. So our textbook states that setting is more than mere background or underpinning. It can make things happen. It can prompt characters act, bring them to realization, or cause them to reveal their inmost natures. I think that's really telling, and I think it's important to take notice that setting is more than what we just learned in elementary school about it being the place the story is set in, but it actually can influence the story. So it either affects the story or it can be a reflection of the story. So when we look at analyzing literature and diving deep into literature, setting is going to be an important part because it can share with us the tone of the story, it can share with us the mood, and it can really become part of the story rather than just a backdrop. So what does setting include? So our textbook talks about setting including a few different aspects. So yes, it is the place, the physical environment, where the story happens. Whether that's by the seaside or in an old haunted mansion or whatever it is, the setting is the place where the story happens. Setting can also include the time, so that whether that's an hour of the day, a year in time, as we've kind of looked as you go through each of the week's folders, I put a lot of links to this year in history and knowing what's going on during the time frame that the story was published. But the year in which the story actually happens can be important, or even the century. So understanding the context of the story, the when of the story. And I think that it's important to differentiate between the time in which the author wrote the story and the time in which the author intends the reader to imagine in the setting of the story. So sometimes we'll read works that are set in a different time or place than the author lives. So that's important to take note. The setting can also include the weather, which is, the climate in which the story is happening in the environment. This is where we often see how the story and the setting reflects the mood of the story. So if it's a particularly haunting story, you might notice that it's nighttime, or it's raining, or it's cold and bitter and there's a wind. So the climate can often affect that tone of the story. And when we look into the way characters interact with weather, that can be important too. Also, overall, setting is about atmosphere. So it's the way in which the environment plays with the mood or the feeling of the story. So atmosphere is kind of that overall sense of feeling or mood that the story presents. And that can definitely, like I mentioned, it can be a haunted evening, and so what would that look like, and how does the weather relate to that? How does the place relate to that. So an atmosphere kind of dominates over all of these things. So I wanted to share a couple of examples of when setting is important and how setting can affect a story. So this is like my favorite first line in a book. And I have held on to it. I've read this story probably 10 years ago. But I think that this is the very first line of the book. So it says, the early summer sky was the color of cat vomit. Now that is a line, if there ever was one. I love it because it really presents not only the setting, because we know that it's summer, and we know that there is some sort of either a sunrise or a sunset going on, and we know that from the color of the sky, right? And the author continues on by saying, of course, Tally, the main character, thought you'd have to feed your cat only salmon-flavored cat food for a while to get the pinks just right. As the light faded, deep blue gaps of night peered through like an upside-down ocean, bottomless and cold. I love the beginning of this story because not only does it have a descriptive element that is completely unique. I mean, I've never, ever, ever heard of a sunset being related to cat vomit. Come on. So that's pretty amazing. But then you have also how it reflects the mood of the character. So obviously, I don't think you would be in a very good mood if you're looking at the sunset and saying cat vomit. Generally speaking, if you're happy, that's not an image that comes to your mind right away. So I think that's important to note, that the mood of the character is reflected in the setting itself. Because if the author would have described the sunset as beautiful and inviting, and the pinks and oranges reminded them of flowers blooming in the garden. So that would be much different. A different mood would be created with that description than what we have here. Now, we have some further development of the setting through the descriptive details, and I think taking note that the darkness of the sky reminded the character of an upside down ocean, bottomless and cold. So that also creates some mood, right? So if we're contemplating something being bottomless and cold, and we think of cat vomit when we look at sunsets, this is just a mood that is dreary and forlorn and perhaps lonely, because if you think of bottomless and cold, you're not thinking you're there with all your friends. So I think it's really important to note that a good writer can use setting to reflect the atmosphere, reflect the mood and the feeling of the story. Now, if you wanted to read this book, it's actually pretty good. It's kind of dystopian. It was written before Hunger Games and things, but it is a similar genre. And I think that it's cool that throughout the story you see a discussion of the main character's view of the sunset, kind of as she progresses in her character, and how her character it's dynamic, and how she changes and molds throughout the story. So I think it's a cool way to see how character and setting can connect to one another. So one other book that I think has an amazing connection to setting is this book called Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton. And this was actually one of Oprah's book club books, if you guys were into that. But it was also made into a movie. So it's a pretty cool book, and it gives us an interesting perspective into South African apartheid. And it's really cool. I recommend reading it. But I think that it's a good example of how setting can actually nearly become a character in the book. And this is the introduction of the book. It's just 2 pages, so I thought I'd go ahead and read it. And let's go ahead and get started. So there is a lovely road that runs from Ikopo into the hills. These hills are grass-covered and rolling, and they are lovely beyond any singing of it. The road climbs 7 miles into them to Carisbrook, and from there, if there is no mist, you look down on one of the fairest valleys in Africa. About you there is grass and bracken and you may hear the forlorn cries of the Titihoya, one of the birds of the veld. Below you is the valley of the Umzokulu, on its journey from the Drakensberg to the sea, and beyond and behind the river, great hill after great hill, and beyond and behind them the mountains of Ingeli and East Griqualand. The grass is rich and matted, and you cannot see the soil. It holds the rain and the mist, and they seep into the ground, feeding the streams in every kloof. It is well tended, and not too many cattle feed upon it, not too many fires burn it, laying bare the soil. Stand unshod upon it, for the ground is holy, being even as it came from the Creator. Keep it, guard it, care for it keeps men, guards men, cares for men. Destroy it, and man is destroyed. Where you stand, the grass is rich and matted. You cannot see the soil, but the rich green hills break down. They fall to the valley below, and falling change their nature. For they grow red and bare. They cannot hold the rain and mist, and the streams are dry in the kloofs. Too many cattle feed upon the grass, and too many fires have burned it. Stand shod upon it, for it is coarse and sharp, and the stones cut under the feet. It is not kept, or guarded, or cared for. It no longer keeps men, guards men, cares for men. The Titihoya does not cry here anymore. The great red hills stand desolate, and the earth has torn away like flesh. The lightning flashes over them, the clouds pour down upon them, the dead streams come to life full of the red blood of the earth. Down in the valleys, women scratch the soil that is left, and the maize hardly reaches the height of a man. They are valleys of old men and old women, of mothers and children. The men are away, the young men and the girls are away. The soil cannot keep them anymore. And I really just love this passage, and I really do recommend this book if you have the time to read it. But there's some things that are important to take note. Obviously, there's a language element here. So we have African elements like Umzimkulu, and we have Germanish kind of language like the Drakensberg. And this gives us, if we look closely into the text and really get to know it, you'll get to know that South Africa was a colony of the Dutch. And so there is a very evident connection to the Dutch in their language and the names of the places in South Africa. But you also have a very tribal element as well. So that's important to take note. And I think that's also when we look at the difference in the way that the setting is described. We have up in the hills are green and lush, and the author even says that it is holy land. And then as you move into the valleys, I love the line where he says, but the rich green hills break down, they fall to the valleys below. I love that because it's not just saying that, okay, you're up on the hills and then you go down, right? Because you go down into valleys. That's a very natural progression from hills to valleys. But with the description of they fall to the valley below, it just already lends us to that mood, to that impression that the valleys are poor. The hills are rich and supple and ripe for cattle, and the valleys are poor and desolate and dust. And I love that, how using the language of falling down already creates that mood. So we have these two, like a juxtaposition of these two very different lands in the same area. And it's talking about the road that runs into the hills. And if you were to read this book, and I think it's worth reading, you would see that this element of land, it does take part, it becomes a character in the book, because the way that the land grows and develops, and it keeps men or loses men, it definitely has a character element to it. So we see the language like, it is not kept or guarded or cared for. It no longer keeps men, guards men, cares for men. So the land becomes that parent almost to the people, and if it is broken, if it is misused, then it can no longer fulfill its role. So this is just an example of how setting can become very much a character in the story. So moving on. So there are different types of fiction that really utilize setting in unique ways that I just wanted to mention. And the book talks about these, so you could definitely go to the textbook and check these out. One of them is historical fiction. So the example that I just shared is historical fiction, written by Alan Paton. It is set in a time of history, not too distant from when Alan Paton was living, but it's definitely a history to us. So it's set in a time and place that is not familiar to our current world. But that's basically what historical fiction is. We have, vast genres of fiction. You can go into, Regency era England. You can go into, like, William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily is a Southern historical fiction. And, there's just tons, because obviously history is so very vast. So you can have stories that are set in different places and times, and that element of setting is really important to the story, because, obviously if we were to look at, A Rose for Emily, it wouldn't really fit in a modern context with the types of persona that are being presented in the story. So it's important to note that some fiction is historical fiction. It's set in a particular time and place that is not our own, and so we need to be able to understand that time and place in order to get full depth of understanding of the story. Another type of fiction that utilizes setting in a unique way is regionalism, and this is when a writer sets his or her stories in one geographical area. And so, for instance, Kate Chopin is a writer that we would see in this chapter in our textbook with the story The Storm. But she's a very famous writer, written a lot of different stories that are read all over the place. But she's a writer that grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, but she also moved to Louisiana and spent a lot of time in the South. And most of the time her stories are set in the South. So she becomes a regional writer of the South rather than a Missouri Midwestern writer, even though most of her growing up was done in the Midwest. And then naturalism is very different, because the setting is more along that idea of atmospherism, very important. So in naturalism, the social environment is a determining factor in human behavior. So the harshness of reality, it's often connected to realism, but the social and economic settings are very important in naturalism. So when you're thinking about setting, and you're thinking about how do I relate to setting and how do I approach setting in a story and trying to analyze a story, there are some things you can ask yourself. So the first one is to ask whether setting helps motivate the plot. So there are times that setting is really just about the background. It's a backdrop, a picture that you know what's going on in terms of where a story happens. But a lot of times setting can be that external pressure, and it can compel the characters into action of some sort. So, for instance, if this happens a lot in horror movies, right? So you have a character and they're driving at night, the car breaks down. So they would generally just stand there and perhaps call AAA or change a tire or whatever, but then it starts to rain. So perhaps the rain compels the character to go to the house nearby to, get out of the rain and contact who they need to contact. So the setting can compel the character into action. So looking at the setting of the story, how it's important to the story, and you're trying to analyze, think about if the setting helps motivate the plot. Does it have a connection to the plot in some way? Another thing is to consider whether the external setting suggests the character's inner reality. This is this idea of how the atmosphere and setting can create or reflect the mood of the character. So for instance, in the first example from The Uglies by Scott Westerfeld, the setting, the sunset, reflected the inner reality, the mood of the character. She was not in a good mood. She was kind of forlorn, lonely, and so the sunset looked like cat vomit. So we can see, so you can ask yourself, does the setting reflect the character's mood or inner reality in some way? This might also be if the character is feeling very confined, the way that the setting is described can create that confinement as well, whether they are actually physically sitting in a small space or if the description of the environment makes them have that feeling of confinement externally, and then that feeling happens internally as well. And then finally, notice whether the setting changes as the plot progresses. So in the idea of the ugly story, I mentioned that the character's view of the sunset changes throughout the story. So it starts off as this very negative cat vomit description of the sunset, and then it changes throughout the story as the character develops. So notice in setting if the setting changes. So if you notice that a certain point in the setting, a certain view, or some sort of element or in the story is connected throughout, if that happens, does it reflect the mood or the plot as it progresses? So with that, keep in mind this week you need to read page 121 to 164, which is our chapter about setting. You're only required to read the story within the short story within that is by Ray Bradbury, A Sound of Thunder. And then we also have pages 516 to 518, which is a story by Chinua Achebe, and which is really one of my favorite authors. So, I mean, you guys have to like it. No, just kidding. I hope you like it, but it's a very short story by Chinua Achebe. So that's also in there for the reading, and you'll be responding to the week 3 discussion board questions, which are already up and running. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, go ahead and do so. And finally, be sure to watch the week 3 lecture presentation. So if you were here listening to my voice, you have already accomplished one goal. So here's my works cited page for all my sources this week. If you do have any questions or concerns, please feel free to send them my way, either by email, text, or phone call. And I hope that you have a wonderful week looking at this literature. So thanks a lot. Bye-bye.